Back when the 5600X launched, it was a complete game changer. 6 cores, 12 threads, 4.6 GHz boost clock, 3 max L2 and 32 max L3 cache, all in a neat little package, including something to cool it down. It was basically the best all-rounder package at the time. Enough CPU horsepower to satisfy gamers for a very long period, as you had to aim for like 3080s, 3080 Ti's to finally reach like a CPU-sided bottleneck in many games, but it was also a little powerhouse on its own. It may not have been enough to enjoy 4K editing, but it was certainly enough for some lighter editing, photo editing, some 3D animations, and other types of similar loads. As far as it was back then, the huge success did not come only from the fact that the 5600X was awesome, but also because the competition was already a step behind and the thing they released half a year later still wasn't really capable of catching up. However, once 2022 hit and Intel introduced their 12th gen lineup, the game changed. The 5600X wasn't the best bang for the buck all-rounder anymore, neither in price nor performance. The 12600K was. Enter Dr. Lisa Su and her obsession with ripping Intel a new one. Zen 4, 5nm, a new AM5 socket, a new IHS that looks like a Water Strider, PCIe Gen 5, DDR5. It's time to take back the throne. So for today, we are going to have a closer look at the new all-rounder entry beast from house AMD, the 7600X. On spec, this thing already looks pretty interesting. Instead of filling this little thing with even more cores, AMD's Zen 4 architecture goes into a different direction. Ignoring the same 6-core 12 threads count compared to the previous gen, we have a full gigahertz uplift from 3.7 to 4.7 on the base clock, 7 MHz uplift on the boost clock, and 5 max of additional L3 cache. In addition to that, despite it not being a G edition chip, AMD built their new RDNA 2 graphics right into it. But don't mistake it for a GPU, it's a display adapter. Do not start gaming on it, believe me. And we will get to that. During their presentation, AMD made quite many quite bold claims. Average 30% instruction per clock uplift compared to Zen 3, up to 29% single-core performance gain compared to previous gen, and 11 performance uplift in a specific game compared to Intel's top-of-the-line i9-12900K, which is really bold and we will check that, and just overall a general uplift here and there compared to Intel's 12th gen i9. And the funny thing is that they do not even care to compare it like to the same tier i5. No, they just claim that their entry line beast will destroy the competition's best. But instead of continuing to talk way too much about Zen 4 as a whole, because we've heard it all, I think, let's get straight to the reason why we are all here: benchmark results. For our testing of the 7600X, we used an X670E GB Aorus Master, a quite heavy chunk. The memory in use are 2 sticks of 16 gigs G.Skill Trident Z5 Neo DDR5 running at 6000 MHz CL30. For our Ryzen 5000 comparison, we used an Asus X570 TUF Gaming Plus motherboard. However, as the last generation was a DDR4 only platform, we decided to use 2 sticks of 16 gigs Thermaltake TUF RAM at 3600 MHz CL18. For Intel, however, we decided to normalize it as much as possible with the 7600X. For these CPUs, we used an ASRock Z690 Taichi in combination with the same Trident Z5 memory. Here just keep in mind that the G.Skill memory has been specifically made for AMD, hence there is an Expo profile but no XMP profile. But we made sure to manually set the same speed to average both platforms out to the fullest extent possible. For the rest, we used a bunch of Samsung 980 Pros in combination with a Be Quiet Dark Power 1200 watt power supply. And to make sure that the CPU is the main thing that we measure, we used an RTX 3090 Ti, all in 1080p. And to fully disclose everything, all of our benchmarks have been performed with all BIOS setting reset to default, and then setting the correct RAM speed with Expo, DOCP, or manually setting them for Intel. And then furthermore, Intel CPUs had all of their velocity and boost features active, so that they were able to do whatever they were capable of. For Ryzen 5000, we did 2 runs, one with DOCP only and the other one with DOCP and PBO. For the new Ryzen 7000 CPUs, we did only a single run variation with Expo enabled, and this has a reason, but we will get to that after the benchmarks. And as the last bit of information, all of our results were created by averaging 3 runs. And now, finally, let's see if the new Ryzen 5 can once again be crowned as the all-rounder king. Starting off with some synthetics. For Cinebench R23, the new 7600X got 15,219 points, increasing the previous generation's result by a whopping 34%. Compared to a PBO-enabled 5600X, the difference may be a bit smaller, but still quite significant. A not so surprising result was found comparing it to a 12600K, in which the 7600X lost by a few thousand points, probably or most certainly due to it having just 12 threads and the 12600K having 16. But surprising is the fact that this year's Ryzen 5 was able to score slightly more points compared to a Ryzen 5800X 3D or a 5700X. Compared to the upper class Ryzen 7 900X, the 7600X obviously lost, but that was pretty much foreseeable given the core count difference. On the single thread performance side, things changed drastically. Here the 7600X landed at the very top, right next to its Ryzen 9 7900X counterpart, and outperforming almost everything we've had on the table. 12500, 12600K, even my own 12900K had no chance. Compared to the previous generation, we are looking at an uplift of roughly 30% for both PBO enabled and not enabled 5600Xs. Compared to the competition, it's actually a 5% uplift in single thread performance, something that was usually one of Intel's strongest points. Over on CPU-Z, the 7600X was able to push 6,181 points on the multi-thread benchmark. This positions it again far in front of the 5600X, but not in front of the 12600K. For single-threaded performance, we are looking at 767 points, outperforming every last generation's Ryzen as well as the competition. On 3DMark TimeSpy, the overall score using a 7600X ended up at 18,564 points, a chunk ahead of the previous generation's 5600X. Looking at TimeSpy's CPU-only results, the difference between each CPU get more obvious. Here we can see that the differences between a 7600X and a 5600X are a lot bigger once the other parts are not used in the calculation. Overall, a 7600X on Expo was able to perform somewhat like a PBO-enabled 5700X from last generation. Also interesting is that the 12600K actually won this general test by roughly 6% on the global score and a whopping 22% on the CPU-only score. We also did a CPU profile test, and this was quite interesting as it allowed us to observe how the overall CPU performance increases by adding more and more cores to the test. For each CPU we get 6 results. The first gray one was used using only a single thread. Then the one after that used 2, then 4, 8, 16, and the last one uses whatever the CPU has. Doing this benchmark allows us to see how well a CPU would potentially perform if the software would solely use an X amount of threads. Let's say, for example, Adobe comes out with an update that limits Media Encoder to exactly 6 threads. A quick thinking would be to assume that once you reach a 4-core 8-thread CPU, everything beyond that would just be unutilized and you should favor a speed. However, with an 8-core 16-thread CPU, 6 of those 16 threads could perform vastly different, yielding you different results. And this is exactly what we can observe here. Let's look at the one-thread results. Here, the 7600X reached 1086 points, which is relatively high compared to everything else. And the only things that can compete are, for example, a 12700 and 12900K, or the much bigger 7900X. By using 2 threads, things stayed pretty much the same for the 7600X, only being challenged by its own bigger 7900X counterpart or Intel's higher-end chips. This then continues until the score for 16 and all threads come to a sudden halt for half of my graph. And this is of course due to none of these CPUs having enough cores and threads to continue going on. However, the thing that I found most interesting here is if we compare, for example, a 12900K at 4 threads to the new 7600X at 4 threads. Apparently, if you would use a piece of software that is limited to using exactly 4 threads, the 7600X would dominate. However, if the developer would release an update that enables the software to use like 20 threads, yeah, well then good luck. Also quite cool to see is the surprising consistency to Cinebench. A few CPUs with very similar results might have switched a spot here and there, but overall the graphs look pretty much alike. But compared to the 12600K counterpart, we can see something quite interesting. At every step of the way, the 7600X is slightly ahead, and this goes on and on until the moment where the 12600K 16 thread versus the 7600X 12 thread come into play. And this is something we can also observe in Cinebench, where the single core performance was better, yet not on multi due to the lack of 4 threads. And as a last synthetic benchmark, we use PC Mark 10. This one is another all-rounder test. However, due to us using the exact same GPU in combination with all of those CPUs, we can see how well the CPUs scale in overall performance. The 7600X scored a quite good result at 9025 points, beating the 5600X quite a lot. But surprisingly enough, also beating most of Intel chips like a 12900 and 12700K. From here on, we are going to continue with simulated real-world scenarios. Starting off with Corona. Rendering the usual image took 92 seconds for the 7600X, pretty much in line with last generation's Ryzen 7, which is quite impressive as the 7600X is running on 2 cores and 4 threads less than the other one. Compared to the 5600X, this gave us a 27 seconds uplift, which is also quite a lot. Rendering out a 2 minutes timeline with various effects using the YouTube 4K preset showed that the 7600S is indeed a workhouse usable for other things than just gaming. Finishing the job in just 251 seconds gave it a whopping 117 seconds uplift. That's 39% better than before. Although it's interesting to see that a 7600X can outbeat a 5950X, which is weird on its own, we can also observe how well Intel's QuickSync technology works, as even a regular 12500 can outbeat what AMD offers right now. For Handbrake, the results are also respectable. Needing 427 seconds to encode the file that Premiere Pro just rendered into H265 showed that the difference to the previous generation is just as big as before. But the raw brute force performance of a 5900 or 5950X was just not reachable. Also interesting to see is that this time Intel's QuickSync didn't help that much, as all of the 12th gen chips that were previously glued to the top are now falling down, staying somewhat in the middle, with the 7600X beating the 12600K. As a last raw CPU test, we have a round of Blender BMW. Here, the 7600X managed to finish in 155 seconds, pretty much on the same level as a 5700X or 5800X, something that we have seen quite a few times today. From there, bigger CPUs just took off. And compared to the previous generation, the new 7600X cut the line down by, again, roughly a third. Comparing it to the competition, the 7600X finished about 20 seconds later. With the raw computer power done, it's time to see if the difference between a 5600X and a 7600X are just as big while gaming. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the 7600X managed to show off what Dr. Lisa Su promised. 253 FPS on average is not only relatively closer to the bigger Ryzen 9 model, but it is completely destroying everything that Intel has to offer right now. Not even talking about the previous generation's Ryzen 5 600X. The interesting outliner in here is the Ryzen 5 800X3D though. Thanks to its 3D cache, it is still the remaining gaming beast. Hard to imagine what a 7600X with some extra cache could do. Compared to a 12600K, we are looking at 23% uplift for the average FPS counter. Over on Far Cry 6, we've seen similar results, yet not identical. Here, the 5800X3D fell behind and the 7600 7600X took the lead, dominating the game with a 190 FPS average score. The comparison to a 12600K looks just as good. For Metro Exodus, it finally happened. With 207.67 FPS on average, the 7600X managed to take the lead, beating everything else. 7900X, 12900K, 5800X3D, and so on. Nobody had a chance against the mid-tier gaming machine. And the 12600K was 28% behind. As the last game, we absolutely wanted to include Formula 1 2020. Not necessarily because we enjoy racing games that much, no, it's because of the claim that a 7600X can push about 11% more compared to a 12900K. Oh, hell it did. Averaging at 429 FPS, our 7600X managed to outperform our 12900K by 18%, a huge gain. But compared to a 5600X, it gets even darker. Okay, with all of the benchmarks done, let's try to structure all of these numbers somewhat. In their presentational material, AMD claimed that thanks to the higher clock speed, higher IPC, and all the other changes that Zen 4 brings along, the overall single-core performance should be about 20% higher compared to the previous generation. Then they claimed that the 7600X outperforms the 12900K by 11% in formula. Yeah, okay, we already proved that one. But they also claimed that compared to an i9, games should be around 5% faster on average. Then they continued by stating that you should get either 49% more performance on the same power or 62% less power on the same performance. And power, of course, meaning watts. All of these are pretty heavy claims. The F1 thing is already proven, but what about the 29% higher performance compared to the previous generation? Directly comparing all of our 5600 and 7600X results, we had a 30% increase in Cinebench single thread, 36 in multi, 31 in times by CPU score, 28 in handbrake, and the list continues on and on and on. And averaging out all of these benchmarks, the 7600X outperformed the previous generation by roughly 31% on average. Only looking at games, it's about 36%, and solely looking at performance software like the synthetic benchmarks, it's 28%. So that's one hell of an uplift. However, while looking at the individual benchmarks, you might have noticed that although we are comparing the 7600X to a stock 5600X, though still with all of its overclocking and whatever features enabled, and one with PBO explicitly enabled. For the 7600X, on the other hand, we did not. And the reason for that is quite simple. It was bad. As of now, I'm unsure if my motherboard is buggy, if PBO needs to get some changes, BIOS update, whatever, or if I have like a really bad chip, or if I have a really golden goose chip that doesn't need any optimization because it will boost to max anyway. I just don't know. But for both the 7600X and 7900X, no matter what I did to PBO, no matter how I adjusted it, the performance just dropped. Not a lot, 1 or 2% here and there, but it always dropped. Hence the reason why for our benchmarks we specifically disabled it and splitted the Ryzen 5000 generation into two runs, one with and one without PBO. However, comparing the PBO-enabled Ryzen 5000 doesn't really change much for the 7600X. So yeah, Dr. Lisa Su, the claim about better overall performance, that's true. And the claim about an uplift compared to an i9 12900K in games, in our case, was actually 16% for the games that we've tested. So also true. The last claim that I found extremely interesting is they said that you can get either 49% more performance while pulling the same amount of power or 62% less power while delivering the same amount of performance. However, at the same time, each and every one of the Ryzen 7000 chips was given a higher TDP. While the 5600X was a sweet 65-watt CPU, the 7600X is now pushing a whopping 105 watts out of the socket. And we checked that. During a longer Cinebench run, a stock 5600X pulled about 77 watts through the socket while boosting to 4.2 GHz all-core, and the 7600X pulled a whopping 110 watts at 5.3 GHz all-core. Though, let's be honest, once you enable PBO on the 5600X, it also jumps to 4.4 GHz, and it ended up pulling 105 watts itself. So, but yeah, comparing a PPU-enabled 5600X to a stock 700X does give you a lot more bang for the juice, 29% on average to be exact, but not the claimed 49%. However, all of this is part of the eco mode, and what this basically does is tell my 105 watt TDP 7600X that it should behave like a 65 watt TDP chip. And it really worked. Changing all of these settings allowed the 7600X to draw only 90 watts total package power, of which exactly 65 came through the cores. And for that we sacrificed a total of 15 watts and 0.1 GHz. However, what interested me the most is the performance difference between my now crippled 7600X and the real deal. On average, we did not see the insane loss of performance that I believed to see. It was random stuff. On average, we lost only 1% performance on our synthetic benchmarks, 1% in Cinebench, single, and 3 in multi, 1 in times by CPU score, and so on. But on the other hand, PC Mark just won 2%, and Corona was 1% quicker, which doesn't make any sense at all. But it is how it is. But to make matters worse, the only game that lost performance was Far Cry 6, 2% in average, 1 on minimum, and we won 2 on max. Which, okay. Every other game turned out to run just as good, but way more stable, with Formula 1 2020 getting a 66% increase in minimum FPS, eco mode. Now to jump a bit ahead for our 7900X coverage, the eco mode is way more impressive once you get to the higher end chips. For the 7600X, it's just funny to watch because the differences are so small that it's getting quite hard to measure something like accurate and reproducible results. But for something like the 7900X, the differences are big enough to make a statement about it. So, where does it leave us? Well, everything that AMD claimed turned out to be true, or partially at least. The performance bumps are definitely here, but as far as the 7600X is concerned, the biggest uplift on the same power usage that we've seen is 36%. 49 might be true for bigger chips, but not for the one we've got. But still, this doesn't change anything. This little thing is exactly like the 5600X was when it first launched. It is an excellent gaming CPU. It crushed almost every other CPU. Not even things like the 12900K were able to keep up with it in most games. And it partially even replaced the 5800X3D, which is freaking impressive. Compared to the competition, it doesn't look particularly good for Intel right now. The 7600X wiped the floor with the 12600K, and in most benchmarks they did not really have a chance. Sure, there are cases in which Intel's QuickSync was able to keep up with them, but now where we have an encoder built into Ryzen, my guess is that within a few updates something is going to change here. Cinebench all-core, CPU-Z all-core, time spy and CPU profile. In workloads like these, AMD just couldn't possibly be able to outperform the 4 missing threads. If, however, you look at benchmarks that are not specifically designed to count together the amount of cores, but more just to work, we can see that the 7600X won by 3% despite its lower core count. Now this is not a destruction. Sure, it is better, but it is not as much as to say that the 12600K has no chance. For games, however, there the 7600X completely destroyed the 12600K. An uplift of 44% is absolutely not a small increment. Looking at the generational increase, as I said in the beginning, the 5600X was not only a great gaming CPU, but also a quite good all-rounder. And the 7600X is basically the same thing with a 30% performance uplift. More often than not, we were able to observe that the Ryzen 5 of this generation just took the spot that was previously used by the Ryzen 7 of the previous generation. This doesn't necessarily make this a heavy-duty work CPU. In no world would I start editing 4K raw footage off of this thing. However, as far as last year is concerned, if somebody would have publicly stated that they were using a 5700X to edit, nobody would have thrown stones at him. And the 7600X of this year is basically the newest version of the 5700X, just a lot better at games and single-core performance. It's like one of the best right now. And let's not forget that the new AM5 socket doesn't imply that each time you remove an Octa cooler you rip your CPU out of the socket. Truly an amazing feature. Jokes aside, AMD's 7600X is a truly impressive piece. Great gaming CPU, impressive small powerhouse. It's not a 7900X, truly not, but it will get most jobs done, which is still a lot more than most people actually need. And as far as I'm concerned, at least until Intel 13th gen launches, and then we would still need to see how they turn out, at least until then, the 7600X is the go-to CPU for everything beginner, mid, whatever tier, before you get into the heavy-duty world, 3D modeling, rendering, and that kind of stuff. Until then, the 7600X is more than enough. The only negative thing I can think about is the fact that there is no cooler included anymore, which puts a bit more weight on the consumer, but I guess this is one of the ways that they were able to keep the CPU at the same MSRP. On a short side note, integrated GPU. Yes, the 7600X has one, 2 cores to be exact. And just like AMD said themselves, this is only to run a monitor. We will get deeper into that once we have all of the Ryzen 7000s and we do like a roundup video. But for now, this is a display adapter. It is not for gaming. Yes, we tried, and yes, it was horrible, even worse than the 5600G. So if you are looking for an all-rounder solution for CPU and GPU while having gaming on the table, look somewhere else. Or just get a GPU. And as a last little addition to all of this, we also did a Civilization 6 AI test. This basically lets the game be played by a bunch of mindless programs and calculates the average time to perform a turn. And I wanted to include the benchmarks, however the results just didn't make any sense. It's okay if the 7600X or 7900X are no benchmark toppers, but every Ryzen 7000 CPU performed notoriously bad. Even a 5600G beat them. So I suspect this is some kind of software issue, something just doesn't look right here. Therefore, I prefer to ignore it for now, and for our roundup video in a couple of weeks, we may have an answer to what happened here. But okay, I believe this should be it for the beautiful little 7600X. I hope it was what you were looking for, and if you didn't notice it before, we also referenced the 7900X quite a bit in this video, and I couldn't have done that if I didn't have one. So you can already stay tuned for that one, which will be released in 2 days' time. We also want to cover the Ryzen 7000 series as a whole more extensively. Therefore, we already have a bunch of other in-depth videos in production, overclocking it by hand cause PBO does nothing, or like for example how much cooling you actually need for a 7900X. You will be surprised how much you need. As far as the 7600X is concerned, not including the cooler wasn't really as much of a choice and more of a necessity. The topic of cooling it down as a whole is just so big and important that we will cover it individually, so make sure to be subscribed for that one. But as for now, I hope you enjoyed it, and also a big thank you to AMD and all of the people in between that made this possible so that we could cover this little puppy here today. Thank you for watching and hope to see you on the next one. Bye bye.